So it's week 5, and this week we're going to get started with SQL Server, Microsoft's enterprise level database application. We're going to get our ASP.NET application talking to it. So we just watched a kind of an introductory video. Did anybody catch at least one reason in the video why we would use SQL Server? Why don't we just use MySQL, which you already know? Brad? Okay, yeah, so I'll go back here. I think you're maybe referencing
to install desktop of your end user.
I'll
Base engine is first installed as an
right. Yeah, so we can create multiple databases within that same system. Yep. Ari?
I was going to say you can manage lots of data, but rather than using an Excel spreadsheet, once you start managing multiple files all at once.
So this is designed as an enterprise level database. So if we are building an application where there are lots of users for a big organization, SQL Server is capable of handling and processing lots of data. Anything else? There are a couple other reasons that he gave in the video as to why we might use it.
It is nothing for inside users, and we can make website or application on the inside?
Yeah, so there's no user interface. There's no front-end application to this. You define as the developer what type of user interface or application is going to actually access the database. Anything else? He said something important about hosting.
It's cheap.
Sorry?
You said it was like inexpensive.
Well, it is inexpensive to host. Yeah, if you go to almost any hosting, pretty much any hosting company you find is going to offer MySQL databases as an option. Pretty much the only other option you're going to find in a shared host, which is cheap, is SQL Server. If you want to host an Oracle database, a DB2 database, a PostgreSQL, guess what? You have to run your own server. Hosting companies don't offer that as a shared service. And the license is expensive. If you were going to run your own SQL Server Standard Edition, which is available to you on DreamSpark. Anybody want to guess how much this would actually cost? Let's see if we could find pricing. Here, so in the Microsoft Store, the Standard Edition is $3,200 US. Right? You actually get that for free as part of your Imagine or your DreamSpark subscription, right? So that's expensive, that license. Whereas if you go to a hosting company, they've paid for that license and they might charge you $10 or $20 a month to host a site that includes SQL Server. So you can find it on not all web hosts, but many of them will support this database technology. The one other important thing to keep in mind is that your SQL Server database integrates well with all other Microsoft applications. So if we're going to build an ASP.NET website, could we use a different kind of database? Sure, we could, but rarely will we, because SQL Server integrates really well. It'll integrate into Visual Studio. It integrates to Microsoft Office, Excel, and other products like that. Anything made by Microsoft is going to interface really well with SQL Server as our database. So if you don't have it, as I said, I'm not giving class time. Our class time is not for getting your machines configured. So I sent you these software links back in August saying you needed to install SQL Server. So if you don't have it installed, you need to have it installed on your machine after this week. Okay, so you have two choices. If you get the Express versions, you can get those right from Microsoft, and there's 2 files. This is the actual database server. You want to download it and install it, then you can run a local copy of your database. One key thing to keep in mind, when you run that installation, it will ask you for an administrator username and password. Usually the administrator, the default username is SA, which stands for system admin, but it asks you for a password. If you forget your password, you've locked yourself out of your own database server. So you need to make sure that you put that password in a file somewhere so you can go and refer to it. And then you need the Management Studio. This is similar to MySQL Workbench. It allows you to connect to any database that you have access to, run queries or execute other SQL commands and look at what's in that database. Or you can go to DreamSpark, which has now been renamed to Imagine. You can download, I would recommend the Standard Edition. The Standard Edition comes with both the server and Management Studio in one download.
So do you want the developer version or the?
You can really use any version. You don't probably need the enterprise version. It has a whole bunch of tools you're not going to use. I mean, if you want it, they have access to it. I would recommend if you go through DreamSpark, the Standard Edition or the Developer Edition, either are fine. We're not doing anything sophisticated in terms of managing the database. We just want to be able to create tables and run, create, read, update, delete operations, basically.
The SQL Server 2014?
You may as well get 2016, which is the latest one, but if you get an older version, it really doesn't matter. As long as the version you get is 2008 or newer. You don't want to get a version older than 2008. But there's 2008, 2012, 2014, 2016. If you haven't installed it, may as well get 2016. If you have an older version, it's not a problem.
The SQL Server 2016 Enterprise?
Yep. Well, Enterprise will be the biggest one. You may want the Standard or the Developer. The download will be a little shorter and it will take up less space on your hard drive. The Enterprise is like the granddaddy. That's the biggest version with the most features, but it also will use the most resources. So you don't really need Enterprise. If you want it, get it, but it's kind of it's overkill a little bit, I would suggest. So who actually has SQL Server running on their machine now? Anybody? Okay.
Tried.
So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you 3 ways you can get connected to a database today. For those of you who have it running, which is not many of you, I'm going to show you, but I'm going to do a walkthrough, show you how to create a database locally. Okay? And I'm recording this on YouTube, so for those of you who get it installed, you can do this later once you have it installed. So the way to do this is in your Programs menu, you go to Microsoft SQL Server. I have 2014 running, and you open up the Management Studio. I'll also show you how to connect through Visual Studio, which is what many of you are going to need to do today. So it will always give you a prompt to connect to your server. So in the server name, it should show your computer name. Whatever the computer ID is should show here under server name. If not, you can just try, in brackets, you can try the words local to connect to your local server. Now, when you install it, it asks you you have 2 options for authentication. The first option is Windows authentication, meaning you don't need a username and password for your database. It just logs you in with your Windows account. If you choose SQL Server authentication, this is where you have to put in the password that you set up when you install the program. And the username will be SA for system admin. And you can check remember, and then it won't prompt you for the password again. So now I'm connected to my local server here. This looks fairly similar to my SQL Workbench. Here's my server. I can expand the databases. And if I want to make a new local database, I can just right-click. Actually, I can right-click the databases and say New Database. And I can create a database here with that name. Creates it right away, and now I have an empty database. So I could then run SQL commands to create a database, or it does have a visual editor. So I can click on New Table. This is a nice feature that MySQL Workbench doesn't have. Rather than writing an SQL command, I can just create a table this way. You know, create an ID column, click this little primary key button. I could create my tables this way. And then when I save the table, I just put in a name for it. Now I have a table called table 1. So if we don't want to create table scripts, if we have Management Studio, we don't need to. This is actually a much faster way to build our database. So if you want to run your database locally, you just need to install the program. That's how we connect to it. If I want to execute SQL commands, I can just click this query button. And just like Visual Studio, it also has the code prompts. I can execute my query. I get nothing back. Now I'm going to do our second walkthrough, which is how to create a database on Azure. Who does have access to their Azure account? So I'm going to log into Azure. And for those of you who don't have the program installed and don't have access to Azure, I will put up a public database that you can connect to for this week. So log into your Azure portal. And if we click on New, and choose Databases, I know these options, they look like they're grayed out and I can't click on them, but actually you can click on them. So click SQL Database. And now it brings up a window allowing me to create a new database. So I'm going to call this database Contoso. This is a sample data set, a sample database that Microsoft gives us. And I've put the script on Blackboard that will create and populate the database. We'll do that in a minute. I'm going to create a database called Contoso. It may ask you to create a new resource group. The use existing option may be disabled. That's fine. If that's the case, you can just create any, put in any name. We want this to be a blank database. And then it's asking me to configure the required settings. I'll click that and it's going to prompt me to set up a username and password for the database. So I'll click on configure the required settings. Now it wants me to create my own server name. And it will be so. Some name I give it, .database.windows.net. So I'll just create it, call it, I mean, you could just use your student number. That way everybody's name will be unique. I'll use GCR Freeman. And now you need to create a username and password for your database. So I'll just call this COMP2084 DBA. I'm going to share this database with everybody in the class, so everyone will be able to use it this week if you're not able to create or connect to your own. But after this week, you're going to have your own. So I'll make my password. I will be on time 2016. Hint, hint to the 2/3 of you who came in late today. And the location we'll pick is, may as well pick Canada Central, because that is the closest data center to us. That's Microsoft's data center. I believe it's in Montreal. So I'll pick that. It doesn't really matter if I pick one of the others, but we may as well connect to the closest location. And I'll keep this allow Azure services checked off. Now, whenever you create a database login for yourself, you should always do this. Go and create a new text file. So I'm going to put in all of these values. So there's my server. My database name is Contoso. My username is going to be COMP2084 DBA. And my password is going to be, and I'm going to save this file so that I'm never going to forget my own database login, because I can't go and ask someone else for these credentials if I lock myself out of the database. I'm the only one who has access to them. I can't ask Microsoft, by the way, can you tell me my database password because I forgot it. So I'm going to save this. As a text file. So whenever I create a new database, I always create a text file for myself with all of the connection information about that database. Because maybe I'll work with this now, and maybe then I'll need to go back and do something else with this database or application for maintenance later. There's a bug or I want to make changes. I need to be able to know how to get into the databases I create. So I'm going to put these up on Blackboard as well, because for those of you who don't have your own database today, you're going to need these credentials. Now we are sharing this, so please don't do something silly like go and put your own junk data or delete things in here. Okay, or no, people in the class aren't going to be able to work. So if you're able to connect to your own database, that's great. So I didn't put in my password properly. I put numbers in. Oh, I need an uppercase letter. I will be on time 2016. Okay. So now I'll also just click pin to dashboard, so it'll give me an icon on the main Azure portal, and I'll create my database. Whoops. Okay, let me try that again. That didn't work too well. That's interesting. A free database already exists for the selected region. So I already have one. That's fine. I'll delete my other database. I just set this up as a test. Oh, it won't let me create another server. Okay, that's fine. But you won't have one.
And I guess it takes a while to deploy.
It may take a few minutes. We'll try it again. I have to use the existing server. Or maybe I'll just have to pick a different region. I'll pick Canada East instead of Canada Central because I already have one set up. Okay, it's happy with that. So I'll change my password to capital I. Okay, so now I have this empty database. Now I can connect to it. If I have Management Studio, I can actually connect to it through here. If you don't have Management Studio, I'm going to show you in a minute how we can connect to it through Visual Studio. So up here, in my Management Studio, I have this Object Explorer, or I can even click, if you don't see it, click File and Connect Object Explorer, and it brings me back asking me, okay, what database do you want to connect to? So now I'll connect to my gcrfreeman.database.windows.net. If you're able to create a database on Azure, you can put your credentials in. If you have Management Studio and you couldn't connect, you can use my server name. It's now on Blackboard for you. I'll make the authentication SQL Server authentication, and my login is COMP2084 DBA. DBA stands for Database Administrator. And then I'll put in my password. I will be on time 2016. Don't click connect yet. There's one more thing we need to do. If I try and click connect, I'm going to get an error. Well, I'll try it and I'll show you how we fix it. It says my IP address is not allowed to access the server. It's trying to connect to my database on Azure, but by default, whenever we create a database on Azure, it doesn't allow remote connections. So what we have to do is go into the settings if you were able to create your database on Azure. I'm going to go back to my portal. And got to find exactly where. There is a way that we can allow those connections, a remote connection. Let's go to tools. Okay. So if I click on the Overview tab of my database, up here, the fifth item should say Set Firewall Rules. If I click Set Firewall Rules, I want to make sure this is on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow in all IP addresses. Anybody that has the credentials can access the database. So I'll put in my rule name. I'll just call it all. And we're going to allow from the lowest IP, which is 0.0.0.0, to the highest IP, 255.255.255. So I'm going to allow all IP ranges in, and then I can just hit save. So it's updating, tells me my rule has been updated. And now I should be able to go back to Management Studio, and now I should be able to access this database. We'll do it through Visual Studio in a minute. Yep, if you've done it. So now if I try and click connect, now it connects me to my server. So it's I'm using my local Management Studio, but I'm connecting out to the database running on Azure. This is similar to what we did in relational database when we used our local copy of MySQL Workbench to connect to our database on DreamHost server. So I can go in here, and now here's my Contoso database, which has no data in it. If I click on tables, there's nothing here. So what we want to do now, we now have this empty database. We want to populate this database. Okay, now I'm going to populate my database on Azure. If you can connect to Azure or your local server, I want you to follow this along with me. If you don't have your own database running, you can use my database for this week, but you're going to need to populate your own database either locally or on Azure in the weeks to come. So if you go to Blackboard, in lesson 5, the 4th item here says Contoso database SQL script. So this is an SQL file that will create a bunch of tables and then insert a bunch of records into each table. Then we're going to build an ASP.NET application using most of this data. So just right click and download this file. Just save that file. Doesn't really matter. I'll just save it to my desktop. It's only 5 kilobytes, so it's going to download really quickly. Now, if you have Management Studio open, it should be connected either to your Azure database or to your local database. Either one will do. Doesn't matter which server you want to run it on. So here I'm connected to my Azure database, and here I'm connected to my local database. So I just click on the server I want. I'll use my Azure database. I'll click File and Open File. And I'm going to browse to that file I just downloaded, that Contoso scripts.sql. And I'll click Open. So you can see this is going to create a bunch of tables: students, enrollments, departments, courses. And then it inserts records into each of those tables. So if I click execute, this will run the whole script. So I'll execute this. Whoops. Notice the message I got. Permission denied in database master. See this little drop down here? By default, when I connect to any server, it looks for a database called master. I don't want to use that database. I want to pick my Contoso database I just created. That's where I want to put the data. So I'll execute it again. I get all the input. And now if I refresh here, I now have 4 tables in my Contoso database. If I want to look at any of them, I have a students table, for example. I'll make a new query here. I'll use my Contoso database, and I want to make sure the data is actually in there. So I have 8 students. I can look in the other tables. I have a departments table. So I've populated my database. So if you run this script either on your local server or on Azure, you're going to have the same database. You'll have 4 tables, and there will be a few records in each table. There's maybe 50 total records in the whole database. If you don't have SQL Server installed and you don't have access to Azure, I'm also going to show you how you can access the database through Visual Studio. And you can do this through there. So open up your copy of Visual Studio. And even if you don't have a database, you should be able to connect to my database now through Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, you don't need to open up a project yet. Just click on View. And under the View menu, the third option here says Server Explorer. So we'll click on that. So if I go to my, under Azure, I expanded Azure. And then on data connections, I'm going to right click and choose add connection. So now you need the same for database credentials again. If you're going to connect to mine, the server name is gcrfreeman.database.windows.net. And these credentials are on Blackboard in the Lesson 5 folder.
Rich, mine says choose data source.
Okay, so choose SQL Server as the data source.
There's SQL Server database file or just SQL Server?
Just SQL Server. So then for my authentication, we're using SQL Server authentication, which means username and password. The username for my database, COMP2084 DBA. Password, again, these are values are on Blackboard. I with a capital I will be on time 2016. And choose save. And now here it says select or enter a database name. If I just start typing CO, it finds my Contoso database. So those are the credentials. You can find them on Blackboard if you're having trouble seeing them. And then I'm just going to click this test connection button down here. It says connection succeeded. So now Visual Studio can connect to that database. And I'll just click OK. If it asks you for the data source, you may get this option. You may get this. So Margot, this is what you had popping up first, right? If you get this option, choose Microsoft SQL Server and check off always use this action. So then it won't ask you every time to choose what kind of data source we're connecting to. And then I'll just click OK. So now notice it gives me a little connection here to my Azure database. And if I expand it and click tables, I can see my 4 tables in here. If I want, I can right click and choose a new query. And now I can run SQL commands. So I can run a query like select. So if you have access to your Azure database and can create an Azure database, but you don't have SQL Server installed today, you can run that script that you downloaded from Blackboard here against your Azure database, and it will create 4 tables and insert a bunch of records. If I execute my query here, it gives me the query results. So you don't have to use Management Studio. If you prefer to do everything from within here, you can, but Management Studio has a lot more features. I usually use both Management Studio and Visual Studio.
So you said select or enter a database name, which is Contoso.
Yep.
And then underneath, I did the test, and I had set that range of IP. When I do the test, it says cannot open server request by the login client with IP address 192 is not allowed to access the server.
Did you save the firewall rule? Did you click save up here? Does it look like this? After you enter that IP range, make sure you click the save button right here, and then it will it'll copy the numbers out of the text boxes and put them as HTML down below. So you probably just had to hit save, that's all. And then you can try again. So everybody should be getting connected to a database now, either your own. So there's three choices. You can connect to your own local database. You can connect to a database you've created on Azure if you're able to do that. If you're not able to do either of those things, everybody should be able to connect through Visual Studio to my database. All the credentials are on Blackboard. And we just go through Visual Studio, Azure, and create a new data connection. And you should see my 4 tables here. Okay, it's 10 to 9, 5 to 9. We're going to take a break here. If people are having connection issues, I can come and see how many people I can help. I can't, if lots of people are having issues, there's only so much I can do. There's only one of me. And then we'll resume in 10 minutes. We'll create a new solution, and we're going to look at how do we get an ASP.NET web application to connect to and talk to our database so we can start displaying some of this data and adding new data.